Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on Indian philosophy. Friends, in the previous session we discussed on Nyaya Theory of Perception, and we have tried to give you a brief as well as an elaborative outlet on the entire theory, and as promised, here we are again for you to give you more and more knowledge on Nyaya Theory of Perception. For the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Dr. Verma is a dynamic professor, and through him we try to get in-depth knowledge on various topics of philosophy. And we believe that all the students of philosophy, and apart from that, all the students from other subjects also are benefited through his knowledge, through his wisdom too. So friends, if you feel so that you have lots and lots of questions in mind while listening to our previous sessions too, and while listening to today's session too, if you raise any question within your mind, you can raise your question with us also. You can ask your question through our live session too. You can become a part by asking questions. For asking questions, note down our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Ajay Verma, once again, and would request him to explain us in detail about Nyaya Theory of Perception. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Gipika. Welcome, viewers. So, as you're already aware, in this series on Indian philosophy, we are having discussions on Nyaya Theory of Perception, and so far we have already had 3 lectures on this topic, and as you're already aware, we are discussing mainly the definition of perception or pratyaksh as given in Nyaya Sutra. Sutra 1.1.4, which defines perceptual cognition as indriyartha sannikarshottapannam jnanam avyapadeshyam avyabhichari vyavasayatmakam pratyaksham. So, in that line, we have already seen how Nyaya being a realist philosophy, how they look at the very idea of an object, since the very word in this definition is indriyarth, meaning Indriyartha Sannikarsha, meaning concourse between contact between Indriyas and Artha. So we have already discussed what according to them is the definition or what is their very broad idea of Artha, and they being realists, so they believe in independent existence of the object of knowledge, independent in the sense that according to them the object exists independently of knowledge of it. And indriyas, as we are already aware, according to them there are external sense organs, 5 external sense organs we are all aware of, and apart from them they somehow have an idea of an internal sense organ as well, which is called manas, and we have already discussed about that, how manas is supposed to be responsible for some kind of internal perceptions, like the feeling of pain, pleasure, certain kind of conations, will, willing to act and taking decisions, having a kind of a psychological reaction on certain things, liking, disliking, so on and so forth. So manas is supposed to be another sense organ according to them. So for them the total number of sense organs are not 5 but 6, 5 of them being external, which are generally sense organs, number of sense organs commonly accepted by most of the other schools of Indian philosophy as well, but in addition they have this idea of an internal sense organ as well, and we have already discussed in some detail regarding what role does manas perform. And then we have also in our last session we looked at the word sannikarsha. So this the essential, the necessary cause of perceptual knowledge is supposed to be the concourse, the contact between the sense and the organs, and the sense organ contact sense organ, this contact between sense organ and object is has a very elaborate Nyayikas give you a very elaborate account of what kind of concourses, what kind of contacts are possible between the object of knowledge, object of perceptual knowledge, and the indriyas or the sense organs. And as we have already discussed in some detail, that this complex kind of idea that they put forth regarding the sense object contact is basically because their idea of the structure that we find, conceptual structure schemas that we find in the world. They have a very elaborate view of what kind of sort of structure we could find in the world outside. What are the different relationships? So the common term for that is Nam Jati Adi Yojana. So according to them, there are objects, and there are some kind of internal structure to the object, and it has a certain kind of and it participates in some kind of a structural unity within which it exists in the world, and that reflects in the sense object contact in our perceptual knowledge of of anything in the world. So this is why their idea of sense-object contact is very complex, and we have already discussed that they were divided into two broad categories. One is Laukik Pratyaksha, where in Laukik Pratyaksha, which generally is translated as ordinary perception. And under this head, they think of 6 different kinds of sense-object contacts, and we have already discussed them in good detail, which includes Sanyog, and which means some kind of a direct contact with the object, then Sanyukta Samvai, Sanyukta Samaveta Samavai, Sanyukta Samvai, the sense object contact between what inheres in the object, meaning Sanyukta Samvai, and then what inheres in what is in contact with our sense organ. So Sanyukta Samaveta Samavai, and then Samavai, which is responsible for the perception of sound, and then Sanyukta Samavai, which is responsible for the soundness, the universal of sound, and last but not the least, Visheshanata, which is a special kind of sense object contact, which is brought in by Nyayikas to account for the knowledge of abhava or absences, since absences are very much a part of our can of knowledge. So since we know absences, and we know to see them, we know to it seems that we know them well. There's hardly any dispute about it. We often use sentences like something is not present on some location, and so on and so forth, and it forms up meaningful part of our discussions, our day-to-day discussions. So that needs to be explained, because according to Nyayikas, the object, the structure that we find in the world around us is also reflected in the language that we use to express our knowledge of the world. So since there is some kind of congruence between the knowledge of the world and the structural kind of unity that's there in the world, So there's supposed to be some kind of congruence, and since we meaningfully talk about absences, so we must account for epistemology of it, how we come to know absences, and for that they conceptualize a special kind of a sense object contact called visheshanata. So according to them, absence is not something that you infer as some of the other schools of Indian philosophy believe. According to Nyayikas, on the other hand, we perceive the absences. So absence of something is a subject of perception, and we already discussed how, according to them, absence of something is actually somehow a part, or rather is in contact with the object that we perceive as a special quality of it. So if I say that a bottle of water is absent on the table, what it means is that this table has this special characteristic, which is the meaning of the term visheshanata. So the special characteristic of this table is that something is absent on it, namely a bottle. So the absence is actually there, presented along with the locus of that absence, and there's a kind of a relationship between the locus of the absence and the absence, and that is called visheshanata. And the same kind of in the same structural way, it is presented to us through the same kind of relation. Absences are presented to us, how much ever paradoxical it may seem. They come along with the object of which they are characteristics, and this is how we are able to perceive them, through the kind of relationship they bear with the locus. But very interestingly, there is another category of sannikarsha, meaning sense object contact, which are called alaukik. Alaukik generally is defined as extraordinary. Some scholars have even defined it as extrasensory. So apart from the six sense object contacts that we have already discussed, apart from that, there is another set of sense object, special extrasensory, extraordinary kind of sense object contacts, which are put under the category of alaukik. By the Nyayikas. Now, why are they called alaukik? Because generally, whenever we think of perception, whenever we think of pratyaksha, one of the conditions that a case of perceptual knowledge is sort of one of the conditions that always accompanies any instance of perceptual knowledge is that the object of perceptual knowledge is presented to us, is in some way proximate to us. So it's there before us to see. It's there before us, to hear or to touch, and it's present before us. It's in proximity to one of our senses. But at the same time, Nyayikas also have to account for some strange kind of sentences we often make, some different kind of judgments that we often form, in our day-to-day activities. So, say for example, when I come across a flower, so I often tend to say, well, what a fragrant rose. So there is something, now such kind of judgments cannot be explained solely on the basis of ordinary sense object context that we have taken into consideration so far. Because we are only seeing the flower. So, the flower is presented to us only within the vision, within the field of our vision. It's not within the field of our sense of smell. But still, despite that, we form such kind of sentences. So at times we find that our judgments are in excess of what is presented to us, and since these judgments we often make, and we meaningfully converse through such judgments, and as we are already aware, according to Nyaya philosophers, there is some kind of congruence in the structure of language that we use to communicate, to express our ideas, and the actual state of affairs in the world. Therefore, if such judgments are meaningfully formed and are expressed in language, then that needs to be explained. Now, the problem in such cases, as very briefly pointed out earlier, is that in such cases the object of knowledge, or the partial object of knowledge, say for example, when I form the judgment, oh, what a fragrant rose, then the fragrance is not given to me. As a matter of fact, my senses, my sense of smell is not in contact with the smell that's emanating from the rose. So, but yet the knowledge of it is in some way happening. So that needs to be explained. So according to now Nyaya philosophers, there is only one way of explaining that in such cases there is some kind of extrasensory perception that's taking place. So our senses are not in direct touch, but somehow remotely they anticipate what actually is the case. One of the examples, as I've offered earlier in one of the earlier lectures, is that we generally see things in two dimensions, but we always know in our behavior, in our judgments, when we form them, we always know that they are three-dimensional. So so it's a part of our judgments. And so there what happens is that even though our senses are not in contact with a particular aspect of the object, but it's strongly anticipated, it's so strongly anticipated that our senses almost kind of make a jump to a certain kind of conclusion, which on the surface seems to be a little unwarranted. So this, Jnana Lakshana Sannikarsha, which accounts for such judgments, where we form a judgment in excess of what is presented to us. So here, what happens is that through some kind of strong anticipation, we form a kind of a more complex judgment, judgment which is more than what is given to us. But it is considered as one of the possible forms of perception in Nyaya philosophy, and it is put into the category of Jnana Lakshana Sannikarsha. And as a matter of fact, it comes very handy for them to explain certain cases of error, where what happens is that on the basis of certain quality that could be common to two different things, we form a complete picture of an object which is not actually there before us. So say for example, if an oyster shell is presented before us, then on the basis of a certain kind of a color, certain silvery presence that is given to us along with the oyster shell, we create an image of piece of silver. So what happens is that because of a certain common property, just like in the case of rose, what we see is a flower rose, but then our senses make a more holistic kind of a picture of the flower, where we bring in the smell of rose as well, because that's considered to be more dominant feature of what rose stands for, so to speak. So similarly, in cases of errors, what happens is we form a picture of what is actually not given to us. So our senses, so to speak, make a jump from what is given to them. So like this is broadly what Gyan Lakshana Sannikarsha, which is an extraordinary form of sense-object contact, is about, according to Nyayikas. Now, moving on to another, kind of extrasensory or extraordinary sense-object contact is Samanya Lakshana Sannikarsha. So now, what is Samanya Lakshana Sannikarsha? Nyayikas point out that every object has some particularities, and also it has certain generalities, or it has certain generic features, which in a certain way are defining features of what an object is supposed to be, or how an object is generally known. So now in Samanya Lakshana Sannikarsha, what happens is that when we look at a particular object, then we not only see the particularities that exist in that object, because if we were to rely only on particularities, then we wouldn't be able to talk about that object. Because when we have to talk about it, we'll have to categorize it in certain ways. We'll have to conceptualize that object in certain ways. We'll have to bring it within the fold of some kind of conceptual schema. So since that would be a prerequisite, so therefore we cannot solely rely on the particularities of that object, in order to be able to talk about it, in order to be able to communicate about it. So some kind of generic features, knowledge of some kind of generalities, generic feature of the object is also necessary, and the term for that is Samanya. So in Samanya Lakshana Sannikarsha, what happens is our senses come into contact with the generic feature of the object concerned, and as we are already aware, our senses come into contact with the generic feature or the universal, which inheres in the object through Sanyukta Samavaya. But the main point here is that the moment our senses come into contact with the universal, which inheres in the object, the moment we have the perceptual knowledge of that universal, then at the same time, concomitantly, we have the knowledge of all the particular instances of that universal that are ever possible. So say, for example, if I have a table lying before me, then that table is a particular table, but since I know it to be a table, that knowledge is possible only if I am somehow aware of, somehow if I have the knowledge of the tableness that is there in the table, in the table. So now the table inheres in the table, and when our senses come into contact with the tableness of the table, since that tableness is something that is common to all the tables that exist right now in the world, or for that matter, that tableness is common to all the tables that have ever been in the past or that would ever be in future, therefore, through the sense-object contact access that I have to the universal that resides in a particular object, I have, a contact point to all the possible tables, ever. So all the tables that would ever be possible, that have that have ever been, I have some kind of a contact point to them. In a certain way, by knowing the universal, I know them all. So since this knowledge of knowing, all the particular instances, all the possible particular instances of a particular object through the knowledge of the universal that inheres in that object, to account for such possibility, which is according to them, according to Nyayikas, is very much real. To account for that, they bring in this notion of samanya lakshana sannikarsha. And now again, this is a special type of sense object contact. It's alaukic, it's extrasensory, it's extra worldly, so to speak, because here we are talking about knowledge through perception of things that are not proximate to our senses. So we have knowledge, say for example, of a table that is not existent right before me. Why, and another reason why this kind of sense object contact is very important for Nyayikas is because samanya lakshana is again used to explain. It plays a very important role, of course, in Anumana, to which we would come later, and since if we go into that direction, it will become a very elaborate discussion. So we'll come to that later when we start discussing inference as a separate source of knowledge. But apart from the role it plays in inference, there is another very interesting role, according to Nyayikas, it plays in the cases of error. So just like in Jnana Lakshana Sannikarsha, we sort of we just understood how on the basis of Jnana Lakshana Sannikarsha, on the basis of some quality that is present before us, we form a complete picture of something else that has that property which is common to two different things, say for example silver and oyster shell. So on the basis of a particular kind of color that is common to both, the moment that color is presented to us, we form a complete picture of a piece of silver rather than oyster shell that is actually present before us. Now the problem, in the cases of error for Nyayikas is that if something is perceived, for any realist, if something is perceived, it has to be there. Whenever there is a case of perception, that case of perception have to be of something real. Otherwise, you are taking resort in some sort of idealism, because idealist thesis is that what we have access to in any given case of what we call knowledge are only ideas, and we have no way of moving beyond ideas. So in the cases of error, we have knowledge of something taking place. And since knowledge of anything has a counterpart in the real world, Nyayikas being naive realists, so they need to explain how such perceptions become possible, even though in a case of error the object is not there before us. So if there could be ideas that are not caused by real objects, then there is a fear of idealism winning the case. So they need to explain how in the cases of error especially, we come to have perception of something that's actually not given to us. So friends, we'll talk about how samanya lakshana sannikarsha, which is a alaukic type of sannikarsha, is used to explain error by Nyayikas. We will talk about that when we return after a short break. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on Nyaya Theory of Perception. Dear friends, there is a lot more for you. You are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break, and we are going to give you more as we have a lot in store. Thank you for watching us. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on Nyaya Theory of Perception, and in the previous session we tried to discuss a lot, and as promised here we are again for you with the same theory, and we believe that in today's session, in this session too, you are going to grab maximum. Friends, for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences. If you wish to ask questions from Dr. Ajay Verma on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Verma, once again. Hello, sir. Welcome to the session.
Thank you, Kritika. Welcome back, viewers. So, we were talking about alaukic type of pratyaksh, and there we discussed Jnana Lakshana Sannikarsha, and we were discussing Samanya Lakshana Sannikarsha. And here, we want to know how this extraordinary kind of sense object contact comes handy for Naiyayikas to explain certain cases of error. Now, in cases of error, as you just pointed out, if we see something which is not there before us, then somehow it's a kind of deviation towards idealism, because idealist thesis is strengthened by such possibilities. If some kind of idea could generate itself without having its cause in the real world out there, then the idealist thesis is somehow strengthened by it. So now, as thoroughgoing realists, the onus is upon Naiyayikas to explain how does it become possible in the cases of error to see something which is, the cause of which is not there before us. So, the cause of seeing something that's not there needs to be explained by the Naiyayikas. Now, how do they go about it? They explain it, in the following way. They point out that what happens in the case of error is that there is a certain property which is common to two objects. Say, for example, a certain kind of silvery sheen, that is common to both oyster shell and a piece of silver. So what happens is, when we see a certain kind of silvery color, being presented to our eyes, what happens is through Samanya Lakshana Sannikarsha, through that, our senses come into contact with the universal of the silver, which is not there before us. But that doesn't mean that the silver that we see at a particular point, that silver is not there anywhere in the world at all. So, according to Nayayikas, we actually see silver, because if they say, silver is actually sort of not seen, it's simple idea that is generated, they, would give away to idealist thesis. So, in order to defend themselves, they say, Nayayikas point out, that when through some kind of common feature, our senses come into contact with the universal, and through that universal, our eyes come into contact with some silver present elsewhere in the world. So the point here is not that silver is not present anywhere. The silver that we see is not present anywhere. Silver, probably, say for example, which exists in Almira or at your home, somehow comes into contact with your vision, and this is how silver, which is remotely sort of there somewhere in some part of the world, is remotely kind of presented to you, indirectly is presented to you through Samanya Lakshana Sannikarsha. So this is how Samanya Lakshana provides a handy tool for Nayayikas to explain the cases of error, and also it plays in a certain way some role in inferential knowledge, because there also we know two things to be always found concomitantly, and on the basis of that we find some kind of a general judgment of Vyapti, which forms the backbone of inferential knowledge. Now, last but not the least, the third type of alaukika pratyaksha is named as yogaj pratyaksha by Nayayikas. Now, yogaj pratyaksha, yoga, which is type of alaukika pratyaksha, is a special type of perception that only a few can have, that only a few people who actually have have known the real nature of the self, who have got upvarga or liberation as defined by Nayayikas. So when you have the actual knowledge, the knowledge of the actual nature of the self, when you are one with yourself, then you acquire a special property, some kind of special property, special quality arises in your soul or in yourself, which is called yogaj dharma. The property, yogaj property, which is a special kind of property, which not everybody has, which which evolves only in those people who have, who now have the sort of direct, who know their self directly. So what happens here is that yogis who are the liberated souls or liberated selves, they can have knowledge of anything existing anywhere in the world, cutting across the contingencies of space and time. So a yogi can know, sitting here, he or she has knowledge of whatever is happening in sort of across the room, across cities, and sort of they can anticipate future. They know the past as well, so they have knowledge of previous births, they have knowledge of what is to come. So the kind of knowledge which cuts across such spatio-temporal contingencies, sort of that kind of knowledge becomes only possible through Yogaj type of special, kind of sense object concourse. Now, what happens is that, once a person comes to have this Yogaj dharma, then he or she also comes to have, this property which is called as Swa-ashraya Samanakalikatva. Meaning, a special property which resides in the self of a person who has, realized her true nature. So it comes to have the property of Saman Kalikatva. Since, the self is, in a certain way extends universally, therefore, self could have the knowledge. So if you know the true nature of self, which is infinitely expansive, so you know everything, you have in a certain way knowledge of infinitely extended world around you, because you exist on the same plane as everything else, signified by the term Saman Kalikat. The Kal meaning time, Saman meaning the same plane of existence. Your soul, is on the same plane of existence, along with everything in the universe. So, because of this special kind of property which arises in a yogi, he or she is able to have a perception or direct knowledge of anything in the world cutting across the spatio-temporal contingencies. This is how Yogaj, Pratyaksha, which is third kind of alaukic, Pratyaksha, third kind of alaukic, type of Sannikarsha, is explained by the Nyayikas. So with this, we come to the end of discussion on what is signified by the term Sannikarsha in the definition of Pratyaksha. So as we pointed out earlier, the essential condition, the necessary condition of perceptual knowledge is that there has to be a sense-object contact, at least as far as Prachin Nyaya is concerned. This is, the necessary part of the definition. But apart from this, there are, three other secondary conditions, that need to be fulfilled for a certain kind of, piece of knowledge to qualify as perceptual knowledge. And what are these? These are, let's read once again: Avyapadeshyam, Avyabhichari, and Vyavsyatmakam. So, let's have a quick discussion on these three remaining properties. So, let's begin with the word Avyapadeshyam. So, the second condition of Avyapadeshyam is added more for the reason of preventing the definition of perception, according to Nyayikas, to prevent it from becoming too wide. The second condition of Avyapadeshyam, that the cognition produced is not dependent on words, has a somewhat complicated interpretative history. Generally, Nyaya holds that ordinary perception involves concept deployment. Therefore, this restriction does not endorse a view held by the Buddhist Dignaga and his followers that genuine perception is non-conceptual, just the word for which is Kalpana Podha. Still, the meaning of Avyapadesha is disputed amongst Nyayikas. So here, the idea is that Avyapadeshyam basically is defined as unverbalized. So, this is that stage of perception. Avyapadeshyam is, considered to be sort of perceptual knowledge, which is as yet not brought under the fold of language. So the main idea here is, as actually sort of, as I pointed out, it has a complicated interpretative history, because according to some commentators, if we start believing that any perceptual knowledge requires that it be conceptual in nature also, that it need, that it always need to be worded, then there is a possibility of confusing knowledge through words with pratyaksh. Therefore, perceptual knowledge need not always be accompanied, it need not always be conceptual in nature. So, of course, it needs to be expressible. When we see something, we need to we often need to express it. But it's not a necessary, absolutely necessary condition. It's not so that unless we have a word for something, we cannot comprehend. We cannot have any apprehension of the object concerned. So there could be several cases of pratyaksha, as is pointed by certain Nyayikas, certain commentators of Nyaya Sutras. So it's pointed out. So they say, for example, a child could have perception of, say, for example, a table. Now the child doesn't know what a table is, but so to speak, the knowledge, some kind of perceptual knowledge, is held by the child. Another example of would be somebody who's deaf and dumb, somebody who cannot speak. Now that person, of course, would have the knowledge of a thing in question, but that person may not have the ability to speak out, to verbally tell you what that person has understood a case to be. So the main point here, that is being put forward by adding the term Vyapadasyam to the definition of perceptual knowledge is that that perceptual knowledge is something that is expressible. But then the term expressible and verbal are two different kinds of terms. It's not verbally generated. Its expressibility always remains as a potential, but it's not the case that it's verbally generated. So some knowledge being verbally generated is a different case from some knowledge which could be verbalized. These are two different things, and since these two different things could be confused, if we say that perceptual knowledge is always verbal, so to avoid this confusion, otherwise it will become too wide. Verbal knowledge would also get brought in under the can of perceptual knowledge, and vice versa. So to avoid the definition of perception becoming too wide, this word Vyapadasyam is added to the definition of knowledge. So here also we must remember that Buddhists think of perceptual knowledge as revealing its object as qualitatively different from how it is revealed through inference. On Nyaya account, there is no such difference between the object as revealed in perceptual knowledge or in inferred knowledge. So here as we can see, the problem is on the one hand we want to avoid verbal knowledge and perceptual knowledge being confused by pointing out that if we say that perceptual knowledge is verbalizable, we are not saying that it's verbally caused, or language has any role in generating that knowledge. So so on the one hand, we want to avoid verbalizability, being considered wrongly as the cause of perceptual knowledge, but at the same time, we also want to prevent this definition from becoming from coming close to the Buddhist definition of it, because according to Buddhists, perception is essentially non-verbalized, and it's also non-verbalizable. So which is, and according to them, perceptual knowledge is also qualitatively different from inferential knowledge. So a knowledge which cannot be verbalized or is not verbalized is perceptual knowledge. The moment it is verbalized, it becomes qualitatively different, and in that case it falls under the category of inferential knowledge. So therefore, the onus is also now upon Nyayikas, not only to to prevent it becoming too wide, but also the onus is upon them to distinguish themselves from the Buddhist definition, which they do by adding another term to it. We have say Atmakam, about which we'll talk very soon. So on one reading, this qualification, which is Vyapadeshyam, serves the purpose of distinguishing between perceptually and testimonially generated cognitions. The latter also requires information provided by the senses, but further requires the deployment of semantic and syntactic knowledge. So there's another difference, and this is a quotation from Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So verbal knowledge is different from verbalizably perceptual knowledge, insofar as verbal knowledge requires semantic and syntactical conditions to be taken into consideration. Now the next condition that has to be met is that of avyabhichari. Avyabhichari, the word signifies non-deviating. So the term non-deviating, avyabhichari condition, blocks false cognitions like the misconception that an oyster shell is a piece of silver from ranks of pramana born. This is tied to the Nyaya notion that pramanas are by definition inerrant, and that false cognitive presentations are not truly pramanas but pseudo-pramanas or praman abhas. Though we may mistakenly take a pseudo-pramana like the illusion of a person in the distance to be the real thing, it is not perception. And similar pramana terms have success grammar for Nyaya. This is again quotation from Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So what is to be noted here is that unlike the idealist, for Nyayikas, perception is not synonymous with perceptual content. Perception as a pramana is different from perception as perceptual content. So the idea of bringing Vyabhichari here is that, as pointed out, perception is much more than its perceptual content. The perceptual content that is handed down to us, that is phenomenally presented to us, that is phenomenologically given to us, has a counterpart in the real world. It is, it sort of gives us a clue to something that is out there. It is caused by something out there. And so far as it is truly presenting the structure of what is presented, to us in perception, so far as there is actual correspondence between the content of perception and the cause of that content of perception. So far as there is an actual correspondence between the two, the pramana, the perceptual knowledge is valid. Otherwise, it would be erroneous, if the object that is a part of our judgment does not have any correspondence with the object that has caused it. Say, for example, in the case of error, seeing silver in an oyster shell. So what is we form the judgment of there being a piece of silver, but that is caused by not silver, that is being caused by the piece of oyster shell out there. So there is a mismatch between the cause of perception and the content of perception, the judgment formed on the basis of that perception. So perceptual knowledge has to be free of such cases. It has to be non-deviating. It has to be a case of non-error. It shouldn't be, something shouldn't be erroneously seen in perception. Now, the fourth condition, which is determinate, signified by the term vyavasayatmakam, blocks cognition which are merely doubtful from the ranks of pramana born. Dubious cognitions like that of a distant person at dusk do not convey misleadingly false information, but being unclear, they do not properly apprehend the object in question. It could be a person or a post. As such, one neither correctly grasps its character nor falsely takes it to represent accurately a certain object. Later Nayayikas, most notably Vachaspati Mishra, read the qualifier not dependent on words and determinate disjunctively in order to say that perception may be non-propositional or propositional. However anachronistic this may be as an interpretation of the Nyaya Sutra, this division is accepted by the later Nyaya. This again excerpt, Nyaya definition of perception from Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So the main idea here is that the thing under apprehension in a case of perception should be communicable. It should be determinate in character. So it is basically this condition is brought in to discount the cases of, say, for example, non-judgmental cases of non-judgment, like cases of doubt. So in doubt, our judgment is not categorical. We don't say this is a piece of silver. Actually, we are hanging somewhere in between two possibilities. So the judgment hasn't really taken a specific categorical form. So unless our judgment has taken some kind of categorical formulation, the question of it being true or false does not even arise. So therefore, a judgment based on perception has to be determinate in character in order to be epistemologically in order to have any epistemological status for us. Now, perception, according to the atomistic standpoint of the system, all complex things are explained as the result of putting together of the simples constituting them. The complex of Savikalpika also is brought under this rule, and it is assumed that it presupposes necessarily simple or nirvikalpika perception, which presents the isolated object altogether uncharacterized. Thus, if at any time we cognize that a cow is white, we must, it is assumed, necessarily have perceived previously a cow by itself, the whiteness by itself, and the relation of samavaya between them also by itself. So the Savikalpika becomes a process of compounding units separately given and not one of discrimination within a mass. This is from the book Outlines of Indian Philosophy by M. Hiriyanna. So another reason why these two apparently opposite conditions, vyavasayatmakam and Avyapdeshyam are brought in within the same definition is because according to Nyayikas, perception could be nirvikalp or savikalp. So we may be we may perceive certain things where we have knowledge of certain kind of parts of an object, but we haven't put them together into a single unit for it to become savikalpika perception. So friends, this is all we have time for today. So here we discussed all the other three conditions apart from Indriyats and Nikasha that have to be met, according to Nyayikas for something being some kind of knowledge to qualify as perceptual knowledge. So we'll continue our discussion on other aspects of Nyaya philosophy in our forthcoming lectures. That is all for today. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We are going to meet again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.